December 16th, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The world is white and silent. A cold mist curls between skeletal trees, turning every branch into a ghostly silhouette. It is a morning that feels too quiet for war. Hidden behind this stillness, thousands of German soldiers stand ready. The steel of their helmets glistens faintly through the fog. Tank engines idle low, muffled by the mist. Breath turns to vapor. No birds, no movement. Only the hum of machines waiting to wake. Across the tree line, American sentries from the 99th Infantry Division peer into the haze, unaware of what sleeps beyond it. Their radios crackle faintly. The fog feels heavy, unnatural, almost protective. Then, at 5:30 a.m., the forest erupts. Artillery flashes behind the fog like lightning in a storm. The ground shakes. Trees splinter. From the white curtain, German panzers emerge, black shapes moving in silence and fire. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble, has begun. And the fog, dismissed as chance, has become Germany's most dangerous ally. By the winter of 1944, the German Reich was dying on its feet. From the east, the Red Army's armored spearheads had broken across Poland and pressed toward the Oder River. From the west, the Anglo-American armies had torn through France after the Normandy landings and were pushing toward the Rhine. Hitler's promise of 1,000 years had lasted barely 12. Yet the German dictator still believed in one more miracle, a counterstroke, so fierce it could split the Allied coalition and perhaps force peace on Germany's terms. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its purpose, to drive a knife into the thin Allied lines in Belgium, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and divide the British from the Americans. If successful, it could delay defeat for months, maybe more. The plan was as bold as it was desperate. The chosen ground, the Ardennes, was the same forest through which Germany had invaded France in 1940. Back then, it had been the perfect backdoor, a region the Allies had considered impassable for large armored forces. In 1944, Allied command again believed it quiet and safe, a sector held mainly by inexperienced or exhausted American divisions. To Hitler, that complacency was an invitation. Deep in the Reich Chancellery, maps were drawn in secrecy. Fuel, ammunition, and tanks were hoarded from other fronts. Elite panzer divisions, including the 1st SS Panzer under Joachim Peiper, were quietly redeployed west under the veil of night. Orders were whispered, not written. Even many German officers did not know the true objective until days before the assault. But there was a problem no planner could ignore: the weather. By December, the skies over northern Europe were a turbulent gray sea. Dense cloud, sleet, and freezing fog rolling in from the North Sea. For the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, this meant little. Its strength was a shadow of what it had been. But for the Allies, whose dominance depended on clear skies for reconnaissance and close air support, poor weather could be crippling. Hitler, whose faith in astrology and intuition had long eclipsed his trust in reason, saw an omen in the clouds. The fog, he believed, was providence, a divine cover that would blind the Allies to his army's movement. He dismissed his meteorologist's doubts with a single command: the attack goes on. The fog will help us. At Allied headquarters, confidence reigned. Intelligence officers had detected signs of German activity, but they assumed it was defensive. The Wehrmacht, they thought, was too broken to launch another major offensive. American GIs in the Ardennes were told they were in a quiet sector, a place to rest before the final push into Germany. The calm before the storm was deceptive. On the night of December 15th, a deep mist swallowed the forest. Patrols could barely see 10 meters ahead. Radio signals crackled and vanished in static. Artillery spotters reported visibility near zero. Still, No one imagined an entire army was hidden inside that fog. In total, nearly 250,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 1,600 artillery pieces lay waiting. They stood in silence along a 130-kilometer front, stretching from Monschau to Echternach. Engines were not to start until the order came. Even horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth to avoid noise. When dawn came, the fog refused to lift. It rolled low and heavy across the Ardennes, swallowing everything in a cold, white stillness. To the Allied sentries, it was just another miserable December morning. To the Germans, it was the signal they had prayed for. At 5:30 a.m., the guns opened fire, 1,600 of them, and the last great gamble of Nazi Germany began. The fog had granted them surprise, but as the offensive surged forward, that same fog would soon reveal itself as both ally and enemy. In Berlin, the plan was spoken of as destiny. By early December 1944, the German High Command, or what remained of it, stood divided between reality and delusion. Generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model privately doubted the feasibility of Hitler's vision. They had seen the Eastern Front collapse, the Luftwaffe gutted, the fuel depots empty. Yet no one dared oppose him openly. The Führer demanded a winter offensive, and so it would come, with or without logic. The codename Wacht am Rhein was chosen deliberately to mislead Allied intelligence. It suggested a defensive stance, a symbolic watch on Germany's western frontier. In truth, it was the most aggressive operation the Reich had attempted since Kursk. Hitler's idea was simple, almost romantic in its desperation. Drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to sue for peace before the Red Army reached Berlin. To achieve this, he would gamble everything. He ordered the redeployment of elite formations from the Eastern Front and Western Reserves, including the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel. The total force assembled was vast, roughly 30 divisions, including 12 armored, but it was held together by little more than willpower. Fuel shortages meant every kilometer mattered. Vehicles were rationed to the liter. Ammunition was counted by the shell. Still, Hitler believed surprise would make up for scarcity. And surprise demanded silence. Orders were handwritten, then burned. Communications were restricted to couriers. Radio transmissions were kept to a minimum. Even Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were limited to avoid Allied radar detection. The Germans had become ghosts in their own country, moving at night, hidden by weather, swallowed by fog. That fog became their shield. In field reports, German meteorologists warned of unstable conditions. The Ardennes was known for sudden whiteouts and freezing mist. Hitler waved it away. "The fog will favor us," he told his generals. "Without the sun, the enemy is blind." He was right, but only partly. For the Allies, the same weather meant their most valuable assets, air reconnaissance and tactical bombing, were neutralized. Throughout 1944, Allied aircraft had been the eyes and claws of the Western Front. From the skies, they could spot any German movement within hours and devastate columns before they reached the front. But now, the low ceiling of cloud and dense fog over Belgium and Western Germany grounded them completely. By mid-December, the U.S. 9th Air Force had reduced operations to almost zero. Pilots reported visibility under 300 meters and instrument-only conditions. Airfields froze solid. Even supply drops struggled. The fog was not just weather, it was a force multiplier. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, complacency set in. Intelligence analysts noticed troop movements east of the Ardennes, but most believed it was the shifting of reserves to meet the Soviets. General Omar Bradley called the Ardennes a quiet sector. Even Dwight Eisenhower, while cautious, had no indication of an imminent German breakthrough. The assumption was simple. Germany no longer had the strength to attack. American troops stationed in the Ardennes reflected that attitude. Many units, like the 106th Infantry Division, were green and under-equipped. Soldiers built log cabins, decorated trees for Christmas, and wrote home about peaceful duty. For them, the front line was a winter forest where boredom replaced fear. Then, small signs began to appear. Locals reported hearing engines in the night, far more than usual. Allied patrols vanished in the woods without trace. Roadblocks found strange tire tracks leading west. Some officers raised alarms, only to be told they were imagining ghosts. The fog deepened, both literal and mental. On December 15th, the eve of the attack, Allied weather reports still predicted no significant enemy movement. The following morning, those predictions collapsed into thunder. When the artillery opened, the forest floor trembled for miles. Entire battalions were caught in their tents. Communications cut out within minutes. American commanders tried to raise air support, but the skies were blind. The Germans surged forward under the fog's embrace. Tanks rolled across hidden roads. Half-tracks followed ghostly columns of infantry. To the Allies, it was as if the earth itself had opened and released an army from nowhere. But while the fog gave birth to surprise, it also began to conceal danger. For beneath it, the German timetable started to fracture. Fuel convoys lost their way, and units became separated in the mist. What began as an advantage would soon turn into a trap. The fog was both sword and shroud, the weapon that blinded the Allies and confused the Germans. For the men on the ground, the fog was not a strategic concept. It was a living thing. It crept into their clothes, froze their breath, and swallowed the world around them. In the Ardennes, visibility often fell to 10 meters or less. Soldiers spoke in whispers, hearing only boots crunching in snow and the faint metallic groan of tanks somewhere unseen. For American troops, the fog meant confusion. Friend and foe could appear out of nowhere. A sentry could blink and suddenly see German paratroopers materializing from the haze. In some sectors, soldiers fired at shadows that turned out to be trees or their own comrades. German troops, though initially emboldened, faced the same terror. The fog hid their movements, yes, but it also disoriented them. Compass readings failed. Road signs were wrong or missing. Convoys lost each other on narrow forest paths. What should have been a swift armored advance turned into a ghost march, engines rumbling in darkness, each crew unsure if the silhouette ahead was an ally or an ambush. Yet within that blindness, courage took strange forms. At Bastogne, young American medics crawled through fog to retrieve the wounded, guided only by cries and muffled explosions. German infantrymen marched until their boots cracked from ice, clutching rifles to their chests for warmth. There was no glory, no parade, only endurance. The fog didn't discriminate between armies. It swallowed everyone equally. For commanders, the fog was both opportunity and nightmare. German Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel viewed it as a temporary shield. If they could advance deep enough before it lifted, they could reach the Meuse River and force the Allies into disarray. Their orders were precise: advance by night, seize key crossroads by morning. But in the fog, precision vanished. Radio communications, already weak, became chaotic. Units reported enemy contact, only to discover they were firing at friendly forces. The 2nd Panzer Division lost nearly 12 hours after taking a wrong turn. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the SS, found itself on roads too narrow for its Tiger tanks. Villages marked clearly on maps turned out to be invisible in the mist. For the Americans, it was worse. Entire divisions were cut off. Command posts couldn't get accurate positions of their own troops. When orders finally arrived, they often no longer matched reality. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges of the U.S. First Army described those early days as fighting shadows in a mirror. The fog made traditional reconnaissance impossible. Field observers could not see artillery impacts. Spotter planes were grounded. Tanks advanced blindly into ambushes. It was, in effect, a war of sound. Soldiers listening for engines, for the snap of a bolt, for anything that told them where the enemy truly was. And through that confusion, the Germans gained ground. Towns like St. Vith and Clairvaux fell in hours. By December 18th, the German salient bulged deep into Allied lines. On maps at Schaeff headquarters, it looked like a knife thrust into the heart of Belgium. A bulge, as journalists would later call it. But even as they advanced, the Germans began to sense the trap forming beneath the fog. Every mile gained came at the cost of direction. By 1944, the Allies had built one of the most advanced meteorological and radar networks in history. Forecasting stations stretched from Iceland to the Pyrenees. Yet all that technology relied on one thing: visibility. In the Ardennes, the dense winter fog broke every rule. Radar could not penetrate the thick atmospheric moisture of the region. Ground stations detected nothing unusual. High-altitude reconnaissance planes, usually the Allies' first warning system, were grounded by icing conditions. Even radio direction finders struggled in the stormy, electromagnetic interference that followed. Meteorologists at Schaeff headquarters recorded one of the longest continuous fog periods of the European winter campaign. For 9 days, the skies over Belgium and Luxembourg remained sealed. The 9th Tactical Air Force reported less than 5% operational capability. Fighter bombers sat idle while German armor roamed freely under the clouds. Meanwhile, German commanders were just as blind. Their reliance on visual navigation, compass bearings, and field maps meant the fog erased what little technological edge they retained. Columns used white tape on their tanks to avoid collisions. At night, drivers followed the faint glow of the vehicle ahead, if they could see it at all. The weather became a dictator of its own. Battles were fought at knife range. Mortars fired at sound, not sight. Engineers laid mines by hand in frozen mud. The technological war of radar, rockets, and aircraft temporarily reverted to something ancient. Men feeling their way through the dark with steel and instinct. The fog was not simply weather. It was the collapse of modern warfare's illusion of control. And yet, as this veil of nature continued to shape every decision, another battlefield emerged. Inside the minds of leaders themselves, some saw divine intervention, others saw tactical opportunity, and some, like the weary soldiers below, saw only death waiting in the mist. At the highest levels of command, the fog did not only obscure the battlefield, it clouded judgment. In his underground headquarters at Adlerhorst, Adolf Hitler followed reports from the Ardennes with almost mystical conviction. He interpreted the fog as divine validation. Providence shielding the German soldier, he told his staff. Even when communications broke down and fuel convoys were lost, he refused to see failure. The mist, he claimed, was the hand of fate delaying the inevitable Allied collapse. His generals, however, knew better. Rundstedt and Model, both seasoned veterans, recognized the brutal mathematics. Without air cover, supply routes, or fuel, the offensive could not sustain itself beyond a few days. They warned him repeatedly, once the fog lifts, the Allies will own the sky. Hitler dismissed their caution as defeatism. On the Allied side, leadership was caught between disbelief and scrambling adaptation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding from Versailles, initially assumed the attack was a limited spoiling effort, a local counterstrike. But as reports poured in, towns overrun, units encircled, bridges captured, he realized it was something far greater. At Schaeff headquarters, his calm broke through the panic. The enemy must be stopped here, he said simply. His order was clear: contain, hold, and wait for the weather to break. He knew the fog that hid the German army also shackled their destiny. General Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery, commanding adjacent sectors, faced their own storms, not of weather, but of ego. Coordination between British and American commands was tense. Yet, beneath the fog, the common strategy emerged: delay the German advance, reinforce the flanks, and trust that the skies would clear. Each man, Hitler, Eisenhower, Rundstedt, Montgomery, saw in the fog what they wanted to see: destiny, patience, discipline, or doom. But none could command the weather. And in war, nature is the most impartial general of all. Few names from the Ardennes offensive became as infamous as Joachim Peiper, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, Hitler's elite bodyguard turned armored spearhead. His unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was tasked with punching through the fog and seizing critical bridges on the Meuse River before Allied reinforcements could arrive. For Peiper's men, the fog was both gift and curse. On December 17th, they advanced through the mist-shrouded town of Honsfeld, catching American troops completely off guard. Entire companies surrendered before they even realized they were surrounded. The white silence amplified every sound: engines, shouts, the crack of rifles, yet concealed direction. But confusion breeds cruelty. At a crossroads near the village of Malmedy, Peiper's column captured more than 100 American prisoners. They were assembled in an open field. Moments later, gunfire erupted. Dozens were cut down. Survivors fled into the snow, hunted through the woods. The Malmedy massacre became one of the war's most notorious war crimes, a stain born from chaos and ideology. The fog had hidden armies, but it also hid atrocities. German soldiers, exhausted and desperate, often fired without distinction. American defenders, in turn, grew hardened. By the third day of fighting, both sides fought with a ferocity that bordered on primal. For Peiper, the fog that once protected his advance now trapped him. His tanks ran out of fuel, his routes were blocked, and Allied resistance stiffened. By December 23rd, his unit was surrounded. He abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot through the same forests that had concealed his victories. The fog that had once been his weapon had become his cage. War is rarely clean, but in the Ardennes, the fog stripped away even the illusion of clarity. Visibility fell so low that soldiers often killed without knowing who they fired upon. Civilians fled through snowstorms, stumbling into minefields or gunfire from both sides. The landscape itself seemed complicit. Trees exploding, white snow turning black from shell fire, then red. Reports from medics describe men frozen in ditches, eyes open, weapons still clutched. The fog preserved them like statues, silent witnesses to the madness around them. For the Germans, the offensive was sold as redemption, a final chance to restore lost honor. For the Americans, it became a test of endurance and moral will. Units like the 101st Airborne in Bastogne held their ground not for glory, but for survival. Within that fog, good and evil blurred. Acts of mercy, a German medic treating an American prisoner, a U.S. chaplain praying over enemy wounded, existed beside acts of brutality. The weather erased visibility, but also revealed something deeper: that in the white silence of war, humanity flickered only in fragments. The fog was not just atmosphere, it was judgment, nature's indifferent gaze over men lost in their own creation. By late December, that judgment began to change. The skies, long sealed in gray, started to crack open. The sun pushed faintly through the mist, and with that light came a sound that every German soldier dreaded: the distant roar of Allied engines overhead. The same fog that had gifted Germany its last. Chance was about to lift and expose everything it had hidden. At the highest levels of command, the fog did not only obscure the battlefield, It clouded judgment. In his underground headquarters at Adlerhorst, Adolf Hitler followed reports from the Ardennes with almost mystical conviction. He interpreted the fog as divine validation. Providence shielding the German soldier, he told his staff. Even when communications broke down and fuel convoys were lost, he refused to see failure. The mist, he claimed, was the hand of fate delaying the inevitable Allied collapse. His generals, however, knew better. Rundstedt and Model, both seasoned veterans, recognized the brutal mathematics. Without air cover, supply routes, or fuel, the offensive could not sustain itself beyond a few days. They warned him repeatedly, "Once the fog lifts, the Allies will own the sky." Hitler dismissed their caution as defeatism. On the Allied side, leadership was caught between disbelief and scrambling adaptation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding from Versailles, initially assumed the attack was a limited spoiling effort, a local counterstrike. But as reports poured in, towns overrun, units encircled, bridges captured, he realized it was something far greater. At Schiaff headquarters, his calm broke through the panic. "The enemy must be stopped here," he said simply. His order was clear: contain, hold, and wait for the weather to break. He knew the fog that hid the German army also shackled their destiny. General Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery, commanding adjacent sectors, faced their own storms. Not of weather, but of ego. Coordination between British and American commands was tense. Yet, beneath the fog, the common strategy emerged: delay the German advance, reinforce the flanks, and trust that the skies would clear. Each man, Hitler, Eisenhower, Rundstedt, Montgomery, saw in the fog what they wanted to see: destiny, patience, discipline, or doom. But none could command the weather, and in war, nature is the most impartial general of all. Few names from the Ardennes offensive became as infamous as Joachim Peiper, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, Hitler's elite bodyguard turned armored spearhead. His unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was tasked with punching through the fog and seizing critical bridges on the Meuse River before Allied reinforcements could arrive. For Peiper's men, the fog was both gift and curse. On December 17th, they advanced through the mist-shrouded town of Hunsfeld, catching American troops completely off guard. Entire companies surrendered before they even realized they were surrounded. The white silence amplified every sound: engines, shouts, the crack of rifles, yet concealed direction. But confusion breeds cruelty. At a crossroads near the village of Malmedy, Peiper's column captured more than 100 American prisoners. They were assembled in an open field. Moments later, gunfire erupted. Dozens were cut down. Survivors fled into the snow, hunted through the woods. The Malmedy massacre became one of the war's most notorious war crimes, a stain born from chaos and ideology. The fog had hidden armies, but it also hid atrocities. German soldiers, exhausted and desperate, often fired without distinction. American defenders, in turn, grew hardened. By the third day of fighting, both sides fought with a ferocity that bordered on primal. For Peiper, the fog that once protected his advance now trapped him. His tanks ran out of fuel, his routes were blocked, and Allied resistance stiffened. By December 23rd, his unit was surrounded. He abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot through the same forests that had concealed his victories. The fog that had once been his weapon had become his cage. War is rarely clean, but in the Ardennes, the fog stripped away even the illusion of clarity. Visibility fell so low that soldiers often killed without knowing who they fired upon. Civilians fled through snowstorms, stumbling into minefields or gunfire from both sides. The landscape itself seemed complicit: trees exploding, white snow turning black from shell fire, then red, Reports from medics describe men frozen in ditches, eyes open, weapons still clutched. The fog preserved them like statues, silent witnesses to the madness around them. For the Germans, the offensive was sold as redemption, a final chance to restore lost honor. For the Americans, it became a test of endurance and moral will. Units like the 101st Airborne in Bastogne held their ground not for glory, but for survival. Within that fog, good and evil blurred. Acts of mercy, a German medic treating an American prisoner, a U.S. chaplain praying over enemy wounded, existed beside acts of brutality. The weather erased visibility, but also revealed something deeper, that in the white silence of war, humanity flickered only in fragments. The fog was not just atmosphere. It was judgment, nature's indifferent gaze over men lost in their own creation. By late December, that judgment began to change. The skies, long sealed in gray, started to crack open. The sun pushed faintly through the mist, and with that, light came a sound that every German soldier dreaded: the distant roar of Allied engines overhead. Tati, same fog that had gifted Germany its last E. Chance was about to lift and expose everything it had hidden. The Ardennes had become a world without sky. The fog pressed so close that even daylight felt dim, like the world had shrunk to the reach of a rifle barrel. Roads were clogged with snow, wreckage, and bodies. Every direction sounded like battle, but no one could see it. For 4 days, the German offensive tore through the American front like a blade through cloth. Entire regiments vanished into the white haze, some captured, others simply erased. The German 5th and 6th Panzer armies surged forward, their armor cloaked in mist, striking towns whose defenders had no warning until shells fell among them. At Bastogne, crossroads of the Ardennes, the 101st Airborne Division had just arrived, exhausted from months of combat in Holland. They were meant to rest. Instead, they found themselves surrounded. The fog above sealed their fate. Resupply flights were impossible, and radio contact flickered in static. Men ate snow to stay hydrated and burned rifle stocks for warmth. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding Bastogne's defense, wrote in his journal, "No eyes, no sky, no sound but thunder." It was a battle fought blind, where courage replaced visibility. The fog seemed to favor them. Joachim Peiper's armored spearheads rolled through villages where American units were still sleeping. At Stavelot, he crossed bridges before engineers could blow them. To his south, von Manteuffel's divisions penetrated deep into Luxembourg, exploiting every gap. German soldiers joked grimly that the fog is our Luftwaffe. For once, Hitler's intuition appeared vindicated. From his headquarters, he received reports of American divisions retreating in chaos. Propaganda radio spoke of a second Dunkirk. In Berlin, church bells rang prematurely in celebration. But beneath the surface of those reports, cracks widened. German fuel trucks became lost in the mist. Entire columns collided or took wrong turns. Some panzer units advanced miles ahead without infantry support. One commander described it later as an army attacking inside a dream. We could hear the war, but we could not see it. At the same time, the Allies began to adapt. Field commanders no longer waited for air reconnaissance. They relied on human instinct and local initiative. Small American groups, often isolated, turned crossroads, bridges, and farmhouses into fortresses. At every choke point, they slowed the German advance hour by hour. In the fog, courage had a different shape. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely encircled. 7 German divisions pressed against it from all sides. Shells fell constantly. Medics worked by lantern light in the basements of shattered houses. Supplies dwindled. No food, no ammunition, no morphine. The fog still blanketed the town, grounding the Allied C-47 transports waiting to drop aid. Outside the perimeter, American convoys tried to reach the town, but met ambush after ambush. Roads disappeared into the fog, where panzers waited in silence. The forest groaned under artillery fire. When the Germans demanded surrender, MacAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts!" became a symbol of defiance. But defiance alone could not stop hunger and frostbite. The defenders held because they had nowhere else to go. For the Germans, Bastogne was a thorn they could not remove. Every attempt to crush it met fierce resistance. The fog that had hidden their advance now trapped them in a cauldron of their own making. Time, fuel, and momentum were slipping away. Those days in mid-December were the longest of the war. Every commander waited for the same thing, for the weather to change. Allied radio operators sent frantic updates. Cloud ceiling 100 meters, no visibility. Air support impossible. And yet, higher above that endless gray, bomber formations were already preparing. In England, pilots sat beside their aircraft, scanning the horizon for any break in the cloud. They knew that once the sky opened, the battlefield below would change forever. In Bastogne, paratroopers stared upward through the mist, waiting for a sound that never came. The drone of friendly aircraft. For the Germans, that same silence was comfort. For the Americans, it was dread. The front had dissolved into fragments. No one knew exactly where the line was. Maps were useless. Companies fought for crossroads whose names they didn't know. In the snow, bodies froze where they fell, unclaimed by either side. It was no longer strategy or technology that decided survival, only endurance and chance. By Christmas Eve, the fog still clung to the valleys, though the first hints of wind stirred above the treetops. A few Allied pilots reported seeing sunlight flicker through the clouds. In Bastogne, MacAuliffe's men prayed that the next day would bring clear skies, or the end. And somewhere deep in the German rear, officers stared at empty fuel gauges and realized their offensive was stalling in place. The fog had carried them forward. Now it held them still. But on December 23rd, the change finally came. The wind rose. The mist began to drift, slowly, then suddenly. Sunlight broke across the frozen landscape for the first time in a week, and with it came a sound that shook the forest. The thunder of hundreds of Allied engines filling the sky. The veil of fog had lifted, and everything hidden beneath it was about to burn. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight sliced through the mist. The gray world of the Ardennes, silent and suffocating for over a week, suddenly flooded with light. Ice crystals on the branches glittered like broken glass. For the first time in 9 days, soldiers could see the horizon. To the men on the ground, it was almost unreal. Paratroopers in Bastogne blinked against the brightness. German crews shielding their eyes saw shapes in the distance they had not seen since the attack began. The faint outlines of enemy positions, the scarred fields, the black trails of burning armor. Then came the sound, a low, rolling rumble that grew until the air itself seemed to tremble. Hundreds of engines. The fog that had once silenced the sky now revealed its vengeance. The Allies had returned. Within hours, the U.S. 9th Air Force launched one of its largest concentrated strikes of the Western Front. Fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft poured into the cleared air, sweeping over Belgium and Luxembourg. The same airfields that had been grounded in silence now roared back to life. P-47. Thunderbolts strafed German convoys stranded on narrow roads, their machine guns ripping through trucks and tanks trapped in columns. P-38 Lightnings attacked bridges, cutting off escape routes. Above them, formations of B-26 Marauders dropped ordnance on crossroads, fuel dumps, and command centers. German officers described it as if the heavens had opened and hell had fallen. Columns that had advanced confidently under the fog now became death traps. Vehicles jammed along single-file roads were obliterated from the air. Tanks burned for hours, their black smoke mingling with the remnants of the morning fog. Supply convoys disintegrated in minutes. Kampfgruppe Piper, once the spearhead of the German advance, was now isolated and encircled. His radio messages grew desperate. Fuel gone. Heavy losses. Need orders. None came. The same mist that had hidden him from Allied sight had also blinded his own command from his suffering. In Bastogne, the sound of Allied aircraft triggered cheers. For the first time, C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, parachuting crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Men rushed into open fields under fire to retrieve them. The AT fog that had starved them was gone, and with it came salvation. The skies belonged to the Allies again. The sudden shift in weather reversed the momentum of the entire battle. German divisions that had advanced for days without resistance now found themselves exposed, cut off, and out of fuel. Their spearheads had raced too far. Their logistics could no longer sustain them. Allied artillery, aided by clear observation, began striking with terrifying accuracy. Forward observers directed fire from church towers and ridge lines that had been invisible a day before. Entire columns disintegrated in the open. To the German soldiers, it felt like betrayal. The fog had promised safety, and now the sky itself seemed to have turned against them. Piper's men abandoned their tanks and retreated on foot through snow and forest, pursued by American infantry. Many froze to death before reaching their lines. Other units, surrounded and starving, surrendered in small groups. What had begun as an offensive to divide the Allies was now collapsing under its own weight. And yet, amid the destruction, German discipline persisted. At Bastogne's perimeter, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division fought to the last round. They believed reinforcements would come. They never did. By Christmas Day, the German dream of reaching the Meuse River was finished. The fog's departure had revealed not victory, but ruin. Far to the south, one man had been waiting for this very moment. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had anticipated a German thrust weeks earlier. While the fog immobilized the air, his tanks had been slogging north through ice and mud, preparing for a counterattack. When the weather cleared, Patton struck. His columns pushed toward Bastogne with relentless speed. Hundreds of Shermans grinding through snowdrifts, engines howling under clear winter sunlight. Every day of fog had cost the Allies blood and ground. Now, every hour of light repaid it. On December 26th, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The link-up was electric. Soldiers from both forces embraced in the streets, exhausted but unbroken. In the distance, the remnants of the German offensive were still fighting. But the rhythm of battle had changed. The fog's ally was gone. The air above the Ardennes now roared with Allied dominance. In Berlin, the news was devastating. Hitler, still insisting that the offensive could be renewed, refused to authorize retreat. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. But no orders could reverse what the weather had undone. Without fog, Germany's last illusion of surprise vanished. Allied reconnaissance photographed every movement, every convoy, every retreat. Within days, the Wehrmacht's Bulge began to shrink on the maps at Chaef headquarters. For the soldiers still trapped in the forest, The clear skies brought both clarity and horror. The scale of destruction revealed in full daylight. Burned-out tanks lay half-buried in snow. Frozen bodies lined the roads. The white silence of the fog had hidden it all. Now, nothing was hidden anymore. By the end of December, what had begun as Hitler's Watch on the Rhine had become a retreat across the Meuse. The fog's blessing had turned to judgment. The Ardennes, once cloaked in mystery, now lay bare under a cold blue sky, a graveyard of armor, men, and ambition. But the battle was not over. The Germans still held ground. The Allies still had to pay for every village and ridge. The fog had passed, but its shadow lingered, in shattered morale, frozen fields, and the silent dead left behind. And as January dawned over the Ardennes, the true reckoning began. The aftermath of Germany's final gamble, the toll in lives and faith, and the question that would echo through every survivor. Had the fog truly hidden them, or only delayed what they could not escape? By early January 1945, the mists that had once blanketed the Ardennes were gone, replaced by the cold, merciless clarity of winter. The forests no longer hid the armies. The snow no longer whispered the promise of victory. What remained was devastation. American patrols moved cautiously through burned-out villages and ravaged fields, their boots crunching over shattered glass and frozen bodies. The fog that had once shielded movement had preserved the dead in eerie stillness. Entire companies were found as they had fallen. Rifles still clutched, helmets half buried in snow. The landscape itself had become a memorial. For the Allies, the end of the battle brought both triumph and disbelief. They had not only halted Hitler's last offensive, they had survived the largest surprise attack on the Western Front since Normandy. But victory carried a heavy cost. Over 80,000 Allied casualties were recorded, including more than 19,000 killed. Towns like Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and Bastogne were reduced to ruins, their names etched forever into military history. Still, the line had held. For Germany, the numbers were catastrophic. Approximately 100,000 men were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles lay abandoned in the forests. Even worse was the loss of irreplaceable fuel, ammunition, and the last reserves of trained men. Entire units that had been the pride of the Wehrmacht were annihilated. The 6th Panzer Army, once considered Germany's armored elite, returned to the Rhine broken and disorganized. SS divisions that had once carried Hitler's confidence were now skeletal shadows. Captured officers confessed their disbelief. They had been promised air superiority, surprise, and the collapse of Allied morale. Instead, they found relentless artillery, unyielding infantry, and skies that turned against them. The fog, the very element that had seemed heaven-sent, became, in hindsight, their undoing. In one German after-action report, a colonel wrote bitterly, "The fog was our ally until it betrayed us. When it lifted, the truth of our failure was visible to all. The illusion of control, of strategy guided by fate, had ended. For the Allies, Bastogne became more than a military stronghold. It became a symbol of defiance. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled and starved, had refused to surrender even when offered honorable terms. General McAuliffe's single-word reply, "Nuts," spread across Europe like legend. When Patton's armor finally broke through the German encirclement on December 26th, the men inside Bastogne were barely standing. They were frostbitten, hungry, and hollow-eyed. Yet their resilience had anchored the entire Allied front. Bastogne had been the hinge on which the battle turned, a city that refused to vanish into the fog. After the relief, American engineers began clearing the roads, revealing scenes of carnage that words could barely describe. Destroyed tanks still smoked days later. Horses, the German army's last desperate transport, lay frozen in their traces. The air stank of fuel and decay. The battle's fury had vanished as suddenly as it began, leaving silence and the low hum of engines moving west. Meteorologists studying the battle later noted that the weather patterns of December 1944 were among the most anomalous of the entire war. The dense fog that had grounded Allied aircraft for over a week was the result of a rare convergence of temperature inversion and Arctic air. Statistically, it was an improbable phenomenon, one that, by coincidence or fate, had arrived precisely when Hitler launched his last gamble. For German planners, this had seemed providential. For Allied survivors, it was an omen, nature itself conspiring to test their endurance. But when the fog lifted on December 23rd, it did so permanently. From that day onward, Allied air dominance never again faltered. The Luftwaffe's last offensive capability was destroyed in the skies over the Ardennes. The fog had ended. The war, for Germany, had entered its twilight. The Ardennes was no longer a place of advance, but a graveyard of ambition. Yet its smoke and silence carried lessons that reached far beyond the snowbound fields. Lessons about chance, leadership, and the limits of human faith in control. And as Allied forces pressed east toward the Rhine, the true cost of the fog, in men, in morale, in the myth of German invincibility, would soon become undeniable. By the first week of January 1945, the German High Command could no longer conceal the disaster. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last grand gamble, had not just failed. It had accelerated the destruction it was meant to prevent. Inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, reports from the front grew darker by the hour. Army Group B was disintegrating under relentless Allied counterattacks. The 5th and 6th Panzer armies were retreating toward the Rhine in chaos. Bridges collapsed under the weight of retreating columns. Roads once filled with advancing armor were now clogged with burned-out vehicles and frozen corpses. Hitler refused to accept it. He insisted the offensive had taught the Allies fear. But even his generals, Rundstedt, Model, and Manteuffel, knew the truth. They had gambled everything on weather and surprise, and now both were gone. The fog that had promised concealment had hidden their own defeat until it was too late to recover. For the Wehrmacht, it was not just the loss of men and machines. It was the loss of illusion. The last belief in victory, in some miraculous reversal of fate, had evaporated into the cold January air. In purely military terms, the Ardennes offensive crippled Germany's capacity to fight a modern war. Nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,500 aircraft in failed support missions and in a futile New Year's Day counterattack. Operation Bodenplatte, that left its airfields in ruins. Fuel shortages became absolute. Ammunition depots were emptied to feed the Ardennes push, leaving the Eastern Front dangerously exposed. When the Red Army launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive on January 12, 1945, German defenses in the east collapsed almost instantly. The fog that had hidden the Ardennes assault had, in a sense, blinded Germany to the storm approaching from the other direction. In less than 4 months, Soviet forces would be on the outskirts of Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge had bought Hitler only a few weeks, at the cost of the last reserves of his empire. For the Allies, the shock of the Ardennes offensive left a permanent mark on leadership and planning. The sheer scale of the German attack had exposed intelligence failures, communication gaps, and the complacency that had crept into the ranks after Normandy. General Eisenhower, once criticized for his cautious approach, emerged from the battle as a commander tempered by crisis. He restructured his command, improving coordination between British and American forces. Field commanders Patton, Bradley, Montgomery, learned to anticipate deception, to respect the enemy's capacity for surprise even in defeat. The lesson was brutal but invaluable. The war was not over, and underestimating a desperate enemy could be fatal. The fog had hidden more than tanks and divisions. It had revealed the arrogance that comes with momentum. In surviving the Ardennes, the Allies learned humility and the discipline that would carry them across the Rhine to victory. In the months following the battle, as the snow thawed and the fogs of winter lifted, teams of recovery units moved through the forests and valleys. They found the frozen remains of men from both sides. Germans huddled beside empty jerry cans, Americans still crouched behind shattered walls. The silence of the Ardennes became sacred. Villages slowly rebuilt. Civilians returned to find their homes burned, their fields scarred with tank tracks. Some never came back at all. Even today, in those woods, metal detectors still uncover rusted helmets, shell casings, and personal tokens. Dog tags, photographs, watches stopped at the hour of battle, each one a fragment of the storm that the fog had once hidden. When the last German units withdrew across the Our River in mid-January 1945, they left behind more than wreckage. They left the last vestige of strategic hope. The fog that had begun as their shield had turned into their shroud. For the Allies, the path to the Rhine was now open. For Germany, the path to ruin was irreversible. The Ardennes Offensive had proven one of history's final reminders that even the most calculated plans, when built on illusion, cannot withstand the IUC'd clarity of daylight. The snow would melt, the skies would clear, and the guns would soon turn east toward the heart of Germany. But in the frozen silence of those Belgian woods, the memory of that fog and the army it hid would linger for generations. In the quiet that followed the Ardennes, the fog became more than weather. It became a metaphor. For the soldiers who lived through it, it symbolized everything that war truly is: confusion, chance, fear, and the fine line between victory and catastrophe. The Battle of the Bulge had begun as an act of desperation wrapped in faith. Hitler believed nature itself might intervene where strategy could not. The fog's embrace had given him one last illusion. That destiny still favored Germany. For a moment, it seemed to. The Allies stumbled, surprised, blinded by the mist. And yet, when the fog lifted, so did the truth. No amount of secrecy, no manipulation of chance could hide the decay within the German war machine. In that sense, the fog was never an ally. It was a mirror. It revealed the fragility of power built on arrogance, the futility of control in a world governed by chaos. For the men who fought in those forests, German and American alike, the lessons were not written in strategy manuals, but in memory. They had seen comrades vanish into white nothingness. They had felt how silence could be both a comfort and a curse. They had learned that in war, survival often depends not on brilliance or strength, but on the cruel mercy of circumstance. The Ardennes became the last time German forces would hold the initiative in the West. After that winter, every step the Wehrmacht took was backward, every mile a retreat. The fog had concealed their beginning and unveiled their end. When history looks back on that frozen forest, it does not see glory or triumph. It sees endurance. It sees the stubborn defense at Bastogne, the weary determination of foot soldiers, the courage of airmen waiting for skies to clear. And above it all, it sees a simple truth, that even in an age of machines and mastery, war remains subject to forces beyond human command: weather, chance, and the will to endure when all else fails. In the Ardennes, the fog once hid an army, but when it lifted, it revealed the final collapse of an empire and the human cost of believing that fate could be commanded.